I am done talking about stupid commentators on Ukraine from America. My brain is too much pain to keep talking about it. So I'm going to now waddle over to Russian state media and talk a little bit about, not Russia, actually this isn't a Russian state media segment. I'm just so used to watching Russian state media. We're going to be watching the statement from the Zaporizhzhia. Oh, what's this? Estonian Prime Minister explains peace.
Ukraine right now insists that it will recover all of its territory, but this war, which for right now appears to have no end, is costing the most terrible price.
It is, but again, I come to our...
Anytime somebody brings that up, it should also be brought up immediately afterwards what the people paying that price think of it. Don't, like, if you were asking me about a bill I was gonna pay, I go into a restaurant and I eat a steak, I really gouge myself. At the end of the day, I think if I can or want to pay that price, and I know this is a terrible comparison, like eating a steak dinner, but I am the ultimate authority on how much of a price I am willing to pay. Same thing in the United States. If we were to defend California from an invasion, from aliens or whatever, I know it's silly, but Americans can't really conceptualize war. Very few can. Not even 95% of American veterans can't really conceptualize war in the way that Ukrainians are fighting it. Actually, no, basically none. No American veterans can conceptualize it in the way that Ukraine is fighting it. And the few that can are the ones that have come here and fight. And even of the American veteran community, or the ones in service, most of them have never seen war and will probably never see war, because America is one of the most powerful nations on the planet. Right? But putting that down for a moment, it is the people who pay the price who should be willing to say how much of a price they could pay or are willing to pay. I don't think that's crazy. If I was going to buy anything, or you guys were going to buy anything, it is your guys' belief or view on how much you're willing to pay that would be taken into account. Of course. If we were debating, if we were going to pay for some government program in the United States, you know, our democratically elected representatives would be the ones weighing whether the price was too high or not. War is just an extension of politics. It's a violent, terrible extension of politics, but that's what it is. Dylan, may I ask you, why do you pronounce cities in the Russian way? That's how you're used to it, or your friends here are Russian-speaking guys? Just my curiosity. I get asked this a few times. Most of the people I hang out with are Russian speakers. They're from Eastern Ukraine. That doesn't mean they support Russia, and this is a terrible thing that I think the West has not covered well. I mean Western media, quote unquote, is that just because someone speaks Russian doesn't mean they support the Russians. They have allowed the Russians to guide the conversation on Russian speakers in Ukraine for way too long. My friend Bogdan, who was talking about earlier, the one who yearns to go back to Donetsk, he's a Russian speaker. Anna, you know, Ukrainian Anna, she's from Kharkiv, she's a Russian speaker. But those two people are some of the most diehard supporters of liberation that I know. And when I'm talking to people from these areas like Zaporizhzhia, they say Zaporizhzhia. And the reason why is that's just how they were brought up speaking. And I'm going to get a little controversial today. And I am sorry to do this, but I need to say it as an outside observer. Some of the people, and not all of them, I believe the preservation of the Ukrainian national language is super important, and promoting it is important. And I think it's an extremely important role of the Ukrainian government. I do. But I have noticed that there's some people who are nowhere near the front, who are nowhere near the front line, who are not serving, and in some cases are even draft dodgers, if I'm being blunt, who are very, very, very on it about speaking Ukrainian over Russian, and aggressive towards other people to the point of calling them unpatriotic because they speak Russian instead of Ukrainian. While those people are over near the front line fighting, dying, and trying to liberate their country. I'm not saying that people shouldn't learn Ukrainian, or that the preservation of it isn't important, but I think people need to, reflect a little bit on like what patriotism is, what love of country is. You get what I'm saying? And I'm hoping some Ukrainians that are watching are connecting with what I'm saying or know about the type of people that I'm talking about right now. Because those people do exist. They do exist in Ukraine. And, you know, it's not my place to really stick my nose in and start saying, this is wrong. But it rubs me the wrong way. Promote the Ukrainian national language. Preserve the Ukrainian national language. Treasure the Ukrainian national language. But don't shit on the people who are the vast majority of those dying out east for not speaking the tongue. I think that's fucked. Especially if you're not on the front. Especially if you're not on the front and they are. That's my position. I'm not going to comment on it again. Because again, it doesn't feel like it's really my place to talk too much about this, but it's something that's really been getting under my skin.
I come to our own history. Of course, every child knows that war is bad and peace is good. But there's also a difference between peace and peace. You in UK, after the Second World War, you had peace, which meant that you built up your country. Nobody died because of the regime. Whereas here, we didn't have war after the Second War.
Well, I mean, Indians died. And, you know, the Bengal famine and, you know, there's a few other things, but... Malaysia and the suppression campaign that was engaged in by the British government, very brutal, moved a lot of people off their land. You know, I mean, but you know, in the mainland, mostly true. Well, then there was Ireland, and you know, well, okay, she's a you know, she's Estonian politician. She has to be nice, but.
Here, we didn't have war after the Second World War. We had peace, but what it meant was mass deportations of our people to Siberia, where they died. It meant mass killings of people. It meant the suppressing of our culture, trying to erase our language. All of this was here when there was peace. So even if there's peace, which is not sustainable, it doesn't mean that the human suffering will stop. And that is what we have to do in order to stop this.
I like that. That's a good statement. I think she said this very well. I have nothing to add on it. She said this very well. Okay, let's move on. So I want to talk to you guys about the Russian occupation in Ukraine. There's very little attention actually given to Russian occupation officials, maybe because they feel generally pretty powerless in the grand scheme of things, more like a pawn that has been placed there merely to act as an extension of Moscow's long arm into Ukraine. If you look at the heads of a lot of these occupations, they're criminals. The head of the Crimean occupation is a gangster, has been involved in the murder of people. Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk occupation, is somebody who's involved in marketing schemes and fraud, like AAA, which was a scheme that he was involved in. A lot of gangsters. Yevgeny Prigozhin, even if he wasn't involved in the occupation, that's somebody who was a street thug, who was deeply involved in the war and got more gangsters into his army through the prisons, kept the prison culture with them. Yanukovych was a street thug as well. He used to steal hats off of the racks and run away until he married into wealth and power. A lot of criminals. And I think a lot of the reason why they pick criminals is because they need people who can act brutally and don't care, don't have ethics and morals, but also because, you know, if you dispose of this guy, who's going to care, you know? Now, all of these occupation heads are scumbags who are facilitating the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, extrajudicial killings, and all sorts of horrible war crimes. But also, not a lot of attention is given to the actual politics of those managing the occupation, because those managing the occupation are very, very radical Russian nationalists. And so when you're talking about making a peace settlement and drawing the line in Ukraine about who's going to get what, because people are talking about freezing the contact line, it should be discussed who's going to rule over that land and what they think. And even if they don't end up ruling over that land, these are people who still might have a future in Russian politics down the road. Putin's 70 years old. Man's going to die one day. So let's take a moment to talk about the head, because I've talked about and mocked the head of the Russian occupation in Crimea. One of his PMCs actually shelled us while we were in Kherson doing rescue operations with medical workers and aid workers. And I've mocked Donetsk and Luhansk Zaporizhzhia occupation, not Zaporizhzhian occupation heads, but the Donetsk and Luhansk occupation heads. But I haven't really talked about the one in Zaporizhzhia. So I want to talk about Yevgeny, not Yevgeny Prigozhin, but Yevgeny Belinsky. He said that Russia's goal in this war is to occupy not only Ukraine, but also the Baltic countries, Poland, and Finland, because these countries all are the historical lands of Russia. So that means Chechnya, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Finland. My goodness, the historical lands of Russia sure do stretch everywhere. Let's listen to what he has to say. The Russian Empire, when it was shaken after the Bolshevik coup and took a different path of development, lost a lot of its subjects. I'm not talking about lost lands now. That goes without saying. I understand that these are both Warsaw and Helsinki, and Tallinn. And of course, the entire Baltic region is our lands and our people live there. The fact that they have now been made into a dumb herd and trembling creatures, we must correct this. And we will correct the situation with the power of Russian weapons. I don't believe in any diplomacy. Well, perhaps diplomacy should always be present, but I believe that we can retell all of this to Russia only by the force of Russian weapons. Bring back your people, your subjects, who previously belonged to the Russian Empire, and today belong to the Russian Federation. This must be done so the whole world does not turn into Sodom and Gomorrah that is now happening in Europe. So what he's saying right now is a repetition of something called the Russian idea. And I've talked about this before. The Russian idea. Not the Russian ideas EU4. No, I'm not talking about a video game. The Russian idea. Now, what the Russian idea is that Russia is a special country. It's a special little boy with nice blushing cheeks and the cute little dimple, the cute little nose. They're a special country, and this was developed in the mid-19th century. A lot more. It's not originally from there. You can track it all the way back to the 16th century if you really want to. But the general idea is that Russia's special, and it has a uniqueness as a state that makes itself, gives itself a special destiny, and that special destiny is to fight against the degenerate, evil, anti-Christian West, to fight against what it used to be the Enlightenment, but now would be Western liberal democracy. So the Russian idea has evolved over time. It used to be that the Enlightenment was the dumb stuff, like the Voltaire and all that nonsense that pushed against the feudal system of the Russian Empire and the hierarchy of the king and the church and of the feudal peasant. Now it's a fight against the globo homo, against the Western degeneracy, against those who wish to fight against the influence and dominance of the Russian Orthodox Church. That's actually, we don't talk about it a lot, but there is a lot of persecution of Protestants and other denominations of Christians in occupied territory. A lot of the displaced people are actually other sects of Christians. I know a few of them. Point is, though, the idea is that Russia has a special role in history to crusade against this, and this is usually paired, and he paired it in this interview, with the idea of the Russian world, the idea that there's Russia, the Russia we know today, and then there's the Russian-speaking world, the Russian world that should be returned to its borders, that should be returned to it, that these lands were stolen from Russia, that Russia can only exist as an empire, which is why he's not just calling it Russia, he's calling it the Russian Empire. It's because they want to rebuild the Russian Empire. He is quite blatantly saying, and this is somebody that Putin himself handpicked and made the head of the occupation of Zaporizhzhia. He must have had some idea about his politics, some idea about the things he believed, some idea about the things he would say, and most certainly, if he says stuff like this, Putin could stop him anytime, but he doesn't. We saw, for example, Igor Girkin when he was criticizing. This is a hardcore Russian nationalist, war criminal who fought for Russia in Ukraine. Once he started turning against the Russian government and saying, hey, you guys are mismanaging this. What are you guys doing? I think Putin might be asleep at the wheel. Arrested. So Putin obviously can arrest people for dissent, I think he's learned his lesson a little bit from Yevgeny Prigozhin. He wants he has a tighter leash on the new head of the Wagner Group, which happens to be Prigozhin's son, by the way. He has a tighter leash than like a sexual gimp. He has a tight leash on him. So he could stop this at any point, but he doesn't. And his position is openly, we must rebuild the Russian Empire. We must fight against the Western degeneracy. He references it at the end here with Sodom and Gomorrah. This is a reference to the degeneracy to the West. It's usually shown through anti-LGBT sentiment, anti-gay, anti-queer sentiment, saying that Ukraine is fighting for homosexuality, which is ridiculous. For example, I have a lot of good friends here that are not particularly super pro-LGBT. You're in Ukraine. It's a society that's more homophobic. That's just the reality of the situation. If you ask the soldiers, they're not saying they're fighting for LGBT rights. Maybe if you go talk to specifically gay soldiers, they know that if Russia was to take over, there will be no civil society for gay people. There will be no way for them to advance forward on their rights. In Russia, it is illegal to show any positive representation of LGBT people. That is the new expanded Russian anti-gay propaganda law. That's a real thing. If you were to, for example, go on your YouTube channel and say, being gay is okay, that can get you arrested and a massive fine. And multiple vloggers have already been arrested for that in Russia. So they might be fighting for that, but the majority of Ukrainians are not fighting for that. But the idea is that the West is gay, the West is cringe, the West is too libtardy. We have a special destiny to fight against it, and we must rebuild the Russian Empire. How many times do we need to have Russian politicians say something like this before we believe it? We have him saying it. We have other occupation officials saying it. We have multiple Russian MPs saying it. We have multiple high-ranking Russian officials in Putin's inner circle saying it. We have Russian soldiers saying it, Russian commanders saying it. We have Russian state TV saying it. We have Putin himself saying it at the start of the war. When do we stop saying, oh, the Russians really just want peace? When do we stop buying that nonsense and listen to what they're saying? When will we learn? Well, I feel like the Sonic Kid. When will we learn? When will we learn that our actions have consequences? When will we learn? When will we learn that when they're saying, yes, we want to build empire. Yes, we want to conquer this. Yes, we want to conquer that. Before the invasion of Ukraine, Putin did put forward a proposal to the West to try to, quote unquote, avoid a war that he said wasn't even happening. He didn't say it was to avoid a war. He said it was all training exercises and there was no war anyway. But what he put forward was that we remove our nuclear guarantees on Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Poland. We remove our nuclear guarantees from them, and we pull back our military resources completely from all these areas on the border. Now, how this was framed from those who are sympathetic to Russian imperial ambitions is Russia's protecting its hinterlands. It's protecting its border regions. Now, I do want to add the context here, and I feel like this isn't emphasized when people talk about Russia's borders. Russia is the largest country on the planet. Russia borders Mongolia, China, North Korea, Belarus, Ukraine, Finland, Kazakhstan, a bunch of other Central Asian countries. They're a gigantic country. Yeah, they're going to border some countries that don't like them. Definitely if they keep invading them. So I think it's a quite pathetic concern because it's you who are creating the concern. Maybe if you weren't invading all these countries, NATO wouldn't be expanding and they wouldn't have Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. All these countries wouldn't feel the need and feel compelled to go join collective defense agreements like NATO. But at a certain point, after 2 invasions of Chechnya, after an invasion of Georgia, after 2 invasions of Ukraine, multiple breaking of the Minsk Accords and of other settlements and ceasefires that was supposed to work, after lying about the invasion the first time and lying about the invasion the second time, at what point do we say, actually, yeah, maybe they are trying to rebuild empire? The Russian government has been explicitly, openly, trying to find a way to annex Belarus and bring it more strongly under their control for years. And the protests in Belarus that forced, not really forced Lukashenko into a corner, but scare Lukashenko was the opening that Moscow needed in order to assert more control because the West was not going to help Lukashenko put down those protests. It's open imperial ambitions. And we still have people who are pussyfooting around the issue, who don't want to see the plank in their eye, and so they're trying to look for the toothpick in the distance, the vague hope that maybe Vladimir Putin doesn't want to rebuild empire. As the first day of the invasion, he's openly saying that they want to go into the post-Soviet space and dominate it. That the same logic that they're using to invade Ukraine, which was, it is a post-Soviet state, we build it up, and if they're not working in our interests, we have a right to go in there and force them to work in our interests. They also applied that logic to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. He openly said that any post-Soviet state has to exist in favor and working towards Russian interests. And if it doesn't work favorable towards Russian interests, then it won't exist at all. And that was their solution, quote unquote, to Ukraine. That's why they're annexing all this land. When Russia takes over land, Ukraine ceases to exist in their mind. They abolish it, they erase the national identity, and they conquer it, and now they're moving settlers in, removing people's property rights. What else can I say? How many times do I have to find clips like this and keep showing you guys every fucking stream? Hey, here's another guy saying they want to do empire. Hey, here's another guy saying they want to do empire. Do I have to get Putin to say my plan is to rape every single country in Europe? Like, is that what I need to, like, slap people awake to make them think, hey, maybe we should support Ukraine here so we don't have to fight them in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or who I think would be a more likely culprit, Moldova. They don't even have NATO protection. There's already 1,500 Russian soldiers illegally stationed in Moldova from the collapse of the Soviet Union period. What about Georgia? We saw the Russian Foreign Ministry it was the Russian Embassy on Twitter threatening the Georgians with invasion when the Georgian people were protesting against recent bills to crack down on foreign NGOs and other groups that were trying to, oh God, I don't want to, I'm trying to reopen issues from like 6, 7, 8 months ago, but that were bills that were trying to crack down on NGOs. And people didn't like it. They protested against it. And what does the Russian embassy say? Maybe Georgia should watch its tongue, or we'll go in and watch it for them. How dare they try to assert sovereignty over their own legislation? If the people get too rowdy, maybe we'll have to go in there and deal with it ourselves. We covered it at the time. At what point do we have to take these threats? At what point do we take these threats seriously? Russia's in a tough position to do much of anything outside of their invasion of Ukraine right now. We saw that from Armenia and Azerbaijan. I think it's in large part that they don't want to do anything, but I also think it's because they can't do anything. If there was another security crisis in Kazakhstan, let's say more protests against the cutting of fuel subsidies, something along those lines, what could they do? So they're not in the best position right now, but that doesn't mean, but they also weren't in the best position when they were invading Chechnya the first time. And here they are 20 years later, invading Ukraine. At a certain point, we need to take them seriously. We don't need to march into Moscow and change the government. But we should stop them from trying to conquer and pillage and use what Europe developed to try to stop another war like this, to try to stop what is now the largest war in Europe since World War II, and use collective defense. And eventually incorporate Ukraine into collective defense once, hopefully, if we stay committed and Western leaders have a little bit of a spine, Ukraine wins the war.